Efficiency without trust. The Jevons Paradox Squared in digital hiring markets. Why in one-click apply, ATS and AI screening amplify structural market failure. Hi, my name is Sarah Trumbull. I'm the founder and CEO of the Job Applicant Perspective, the first anonymous user reviews for job ads across the U.S. It's the level of go-to-market awareness as well as public service for all the gaslighting out there. I'm running a level of a paradigm shift / restoration, depending on how you look at it, and I try to meet people where they are in a variety of ways. This Substack comes out in written format once or twice a week, and it comes out in visual and audio format too, like this, partly because I'm just trying to meet people where they are, It's important. All right, I'm going to start from the beginning and see how it goes. One of the pleasures of recursive learning is watching your understanding deepen over time. And recursive learning, this is definitely for geeks of labor market economics. I was trained in a physics lab on the principles of logic and science, where writing everything down wasn't just documentation, it was how you noticed things you had previously overlooked. In that sense, this blog has become a kind of a lab notebook, a place to return to earlier insights, test them against new evidence, and see what holds. Legit, my undergrad physics lab teacher for Physics 140 was quite good and very much like a warhammer. But, lessons stayed with me. As I write this, I find myself reflecting on my earliest Substack post. An old insight about coal explains why you can't find a job. At the time, I was just beginning to articulate systems insights in narrative form. Looking back, what's striking isn't the insight was incomplete. It's that I can already see my growth. I'm proud of myself. Since then, I've broken down many features of the online hiring market: trust collapse, noise, asymmetric power, and the lived experience of job seekers inside supposedly efficient systems. In this post, I want to pause and go deeper on one specific mechanism that quietly sits underneath all of it. This is a close look at what happens when efficiency gains are applied to both sides of a two-stakeholder market without increasing trust. What I've described elsewhere as a two-stakeholder Jevons Paradox, or the Micah Paradox, named after my son. This article is about what happens when that paradox compounds. When a Jevons-style efficiency solution is applied independently to each side of a two-sided market, the result isn't the market clearing, it's a system that grows louder and harder to navigate, not because it's broken, but because it's working exactly as designed. Who this is for. This piece is for readers with some fluency in systems thinking who want to understand why hiring technologies keep failing in the same direction. In particular, labor economists familiar with the Jevons Paradox who suspect it doesn't fully explain what's happening in modern hiring markets. Again, these Jevons Paradox is traditionally applied to environmental markets, as far as I can tell, but it definitely applies here. Policy analysts trying to understand why efficiency gains in hiring technology consistently increase applicant harm instead of reducing. Platform and market designers working in two-sided systems who sense that better matching and more automation aren't addressing the real failure mode. And anyone who has looked at the last decade of hiring tech and thought, yes, but why does this keep getting worse? This is an attempt to name a structural pattern that many people can already feel, but they haven't had language for. A note on scope. I believe that ATS systems operate on multiple levels simultaneously, and I might document that in future blog, the 3 different engagements there. But what they're perceived to offer, what they actually offer, and at a certain point, a space where Jevons Paradox and Nash's non-converging equilibria overlap in ways that compound dysfunction. In previous writing, I've addressed the Akerlof-Lemons dynamic and the Nash equilibrium problem. This piece focused specifically on the Jevons Paradox dimension. These frameworks are related, but I'm isolating one thread here for clarity. And just to be clear, I'm not meaning to invalidate any of the other things I've said previously. I'm meaning to isolate one piece for clarity, one thread for clarity. Dive into a niche. I like niches. Setting the state. This is not a history of hiring technology. It's a diagnosis. Over the past decade, the online hiring market has been flooded with tools designed to make participation easier, faster, and more scalable. Each generation of software promises to reduce friction, fewer steps, faster screening, better matching, less wasted effort. And each generation is adopted in response to real pain. We keep adding tools, automation, and layers of matching, and yet outcomes continue to degrade. Job seekers report unprecedented exhaustion and uncertainty, spending hours on opportunities that may never exist. Employers face overwhelming application volume, declining signal, and difficulty identifying serious candidates. Despite record technological intervention, the market feels louder, not clearer. This is not because participants are behaving irrationally, and it's not because the technology is malfunctioning. It's because the system is optimizing for engagement without accounting for trust in a market where the costs of that optimization are not shared evenly. Something foundational is being mismodeled. The promise of frictionless hiring. It's important to acknowledge that the dominant tools shaping online hiring today were introduced as solutions, not villains. The promise was straightforward and on its face reasonable. Hiring would be faster, administrative burden would be reduced, bias would be mitigated through standardization, access would be expanded by lowering barriers to entry. On the job seeker side, features like one-click apply were framed as a way to reduce unnecessary friction, allowing candidates to spend less time navigating forms and more time finding opportunities. On the employer side, applicant tracking systems, ATS, and AI-assisted screening were introduced to manage scale, reduce human bottlenecks, and surface qualified candidates more efficiently. It's good stuff in general. And yet, each of these interventions would target a real constraint designed to make hiring participation easier. But ease is not clarity. I will say that again. Ease is not clarity. What these systems consistently failed to increase was certainty about job quality, about employer intent, about whether engagement was likely to be reciprocated. One-click apply reduced friction, letting candidates spend less time navigating forms. ATS and AI screening are perceived to help employers manage scale, reduce bottlenecks, and surface qualified candidates. But perception and function are not the same thing. Again, ease is not clarity, and perception and function are not the same thing. ATS is sold as efficiency, but functionally it operates as obstruction. Specifically, selective obstruction masquerading as discernment. ATS does not increase efficiency in any absolute sense. It increases the employer's tolerance for engagement by offloading discernment costs onto applicants. It increases the employer's tolerance for engagement by offloading discernment costs onto applicants. Think about it. A 10% pass-through rate is a 90% obstruction rate, a 90% friction rate. Only in a situation with a captive workforce would that be a subscription tier, not a market failure by definition. Applicant tracking systems do not reduce the cost of hiring, they displace it. Discernment and risk are reallocated away from employers and vendors and imposed on applicants, who are required to perform unpaid evaluative labor under uncertainty and without feedback. Again, they're not getting feedback on the specifics of the algorithmic processes that are being asked to, these hoops that they're being asked to jump through. The resulting efficiency is an accounting artifact. Internal employer costs fall while total system costs rise, as uncertainty, opportunity costs, and emotional labor are externalized onto the weaker market participant. Perception of efficiency increased, perception of it, but clarity, certainty, and trust did not. In a two-stakeholder market with asymmetric power, that omission matters, and it sets the stage for a paradox economists already know, one that becomes more damaging when applied to both sides at once. Again, I just want to reiterate, ease is not clarity. Perception and function are not the same thing. ATS is sold as efficiency, but functionally it operates as obstruction, and specifically selective obstruction masquerading as discernment, where the discernment isn't something that applicants are trained about. They're just expected to be able to do it. All the discernment costs are put onto applicants. The Jevons Paradox as a baseline, just to start out here. In economics, Jevons Paradox describes a counterintuitive effect of efficiency. When a resource becomes more efficient to use, overall consumption of that resource often increases rather than decreases. A classic example is coal. Improvements in coal efficiency introduced during the Industrial Revolution did not reduce coal use. They made coal cheaper, expanding its applications, and ultimately drove higher total consumption. The same pattern repeated over and over again when it was electricity, when it was oil, when it was internet, data usage, Wi-Fi. Faster data transmission led to more data usage. Improved traffic flow leads to more driving. Again, efficiency lowers friction, and lowered friction increases demand. Crucially, Jevons Paradox is not a failure of logic. It predicts increased consumption when efficiency lowers friction, but it assumes a single stakeholder absorbs both benefits and costs overall. We were speaking in general about multiple different engagements, but labor markets break that assumption. And again, traditionally, Jevons Paradox is applied environmentally. I'm applying it into labor markets, and I would argue pretty strongly that it's definitely happening in the dating markets as well. But that's for somebody else to work through. I have enough to do with the labor market here. The two-stakeholder Jevons Paradox, what I call the Micah Paradox after my son, just because, person gets to name things and it's fun for them. When Jevons Paradox is applied in a two-stakeholder market with asymmetric power, the result is not merely increased consumption, it is concentrated harm. In these systems, efficiency gains on either side increase total throughput, more applications, more screening, more engagement. But the costs of that throughput are systematically shifted onto the weaker participant. Stated cleanly, in two-stakeholder markets with asymmetric power, efficiency gains on either side increase engagement while concentrating harm on the less powerful stakeholder. What is being externalized is risk, uncertainty, time loss, emotional labor, and opportunity costs that are systematically shifted onto job seekers who lack the power to refuse engagement without exiting the market entirely, aka exiting their access to food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare, which they wouldn't be in the labor market in the first place if they had another option. It's a Jevons paradox, but applied in a situation with information asymmetry and two actors, not one. This is what I refer to as the two-stakeholder Jevons paradox or the Micah paradox. It's after my son. I'm thinking about it in terms of a participant with asymmetric power, a parent-child dynamic, is similar to a two-stakeholder dynamic in a labor market. The child has less dynamic power. So any issue that I create as a parent or the issue that he experiences in the world as someone with disability is going to be asymmetrically affecting him. And when efficiency solutions are applied independently to both sides of the market without increasing trust, the effects do not cancel out, they compound. Let me explain. Side A, job seeker side, efficiency leading to noise. On the job seeker side, efficiency interventions have largely taken the form of friction reduction. One click applies the clearest example. By collapsing application steps into single action, these systems dramatically lower the cost of engagement. The underlying assumption is that friction is the primary obstacle preventing good matches from forming. What is reduced, however, is not uncertainty. Job seekers are encouraged to engage with job ads without reliable information about whether those job ads represent real openings, reflect active hiring, signal good faith employer intent. The resource being pursued, a job, sits at the end of the posting, but the quality of that posting is largely unknowable at the moment of engagement. Bamboo came out recently with the knowledge that 1 in 3 job postings in the US is non-existent. What's represented. Again, job seekers are engaging with entirely lemon market with efficiency tools to utilize that lemon market. Lower friction without added certainty produces a predictable pattern. Engagement becomes easier, volume increases rapidly, selectivity declines, signal quality deteriorates. Applying a Jevons solution to a lemon market doesn't create more solutions, it just creates a larger amount of noise. From the job seeker's perspective, this behavior is rational. When the cost of applying approaches zero and the likelihood of success is opaque but necessary, how else are you going to eat or pay rent? The dominant strategy becomes breadth over precision. Applications scale not because confidence increases, but because uncertainty remains unresolved. The result is not better matching, it is noise. Engagement proliferates without meaning. Time and attention are extracted in pursuit of a resource whose availability cannot be reliably assessed. Importantly, this is not a failure of individual decision-making. It is the expected outcome of an efficiency intervention that optimizes for impulse rather than information. Again, the Jevons Paradox is one-click applies. They optimize for impulse, not information. That's the thing that's being obscured by and large, the information opacity. Side B, employer efficiency to noise. On the employer side, efficiency interventions take a different form, but they're the same overall engagement trap. Applicant tracking systems and AI-assisted screening tools are marketed as a way to manage scale. Their goal is, on the surface, not to increase engagement, but to make enduring large amounts of engagement painless, absorbing large volumes of application without increasing human workload. So they kind of are. They're just wanting to increase the human workload for the extra engagement they're trying to allow to happen. The tools optimize the experience of processing applications, not the quality of the inputs themselves, and thus they make ever-increasing engagement normalized. AI filters do not correct for low-trust job ads. They do not verify whether postings are clear, current, or credible. Instead, they accelerate the handling of whatever enters the system. Low-quality inputs are processed more quickly, not prevented. This creates a parallel but asymmetric effect. Application volume increases, screening becomes automated, signal remains weak, noise is made less painful and normalized, not reduced. And note that this is going to be disproportionate for an employer who can afford these types of screening tools versus like a local daycare. They're going to get a completely different experience here. From the employer's perspective, this feels like progress. From the bigger employer's perspective, from the smaller employers, they start going out of business because they can only pay minimum wage. And then you get these small towns with closed storefronts because of these impressive hiring solutions. Or you get these papers in the doors because these hiring solutions aren't really solutions. From the employer's perspective, it feels like progress. The emotional and administrative burden of sorting through applications is diminished, but the underlying conditions that produce the noise remain unchanged. The cost of that noise is not eliminated, it is displaced. Job seekers absorb the uncertainty, the silence, and repeated non-response generated by systems optimized to process volume rather than establish trust. This is not an individual moral failure, it is a structural moral failure. Efficiency improves the experience of engagement for the more powerful stakeholder, but it still increases that amount, while leaving the weaker stakeholder exposed to its downstream effects. Again, I would say that the efficiency solutions make it easier for job seekers to engage because they're the revenue drivers, and make it easier for employers to experience that engagement. But neither of them are trying to slow down the engagement trap. They're trying to make the engagement trap easier for employers to experience and easier for job seekers to participate in. When both sides compound, Jevons Paradox Squared, in two stakeholder markets, applying efficiency interventions independently on each side can produce compounding dysfunction. Again, I haven't mathematically modeled this properly, so just to be clear, we're not talking necessarily squared versus cubed. I'm working with a mathematician for the specific sums. For example, when job seekers gain one-click apply while employers deploy AI-assisted screening, engagement increases, but trust is not restored. Each side responds rationally to the other, creating a self-reinforcing loop that amplifies noise and concentrates harm. Employers optimize for filtering, so job seekers optimize for visibility. So employers double down on filtering, so job seekers double down on visibility. Add in these efficiency tools where you can double, triple, quadruple down on visibility or filtering, and you're getting what you're getting. The pattern unfolds predictably. Job seekers engage broadly under conditions of uncertainty. Employers process that engagement at scale without improving signal quality. They're admitting openly to posting evergreen roles to actual newspapers. They're admitting that they're poisoning their own market. Like, they're totally decoupled from what a two-sided market is, the economic understanding of what this market is. They're just disconnected from it. In and of itself, this is where we're coming at. Feedback deteriorates and signal noise increases. Uncertainty grows, prompting yet more engagement. At no point is trust increased. At no point is the weaker participant protected. At no point. This is a market that runs utterly without discipline to the unpaid stakeholders that drive all of its revenue. This is a clear example of a Micah Paradox Squared, the compounded effect of efficiency applied on both sides of a two-stakeholder market without restoring trust. Efficiency gains are visible, measurable, and real, yet they do not produce clarity. From inside the system, activity looks productive, applications are submitted more quickly, AI screens process them faster, and processes appear optimized. But from the perspective of the weaker actor in hiring the job seeker, the market becomes louder, more exhausting, and harder to navigate, and they can't opt out. There is no opt out for this captive workforce. Functionally, when nobody is taking their perspective, when there's no market discipline. The structural insight here is captured axiomatically. Sustainable efficiency requires trust. It just does. Efficiency alone, no matter how measurable, cannot resolve structural asymmetry. Without trust, interventions compound uncertainty, externalize risk, and reinforce cycles of noise. Job seekers bear the cost of emotional labor, lost time, and opportunity costs, while employers experience surface-level throughput without improved matching. Micah Paradox Squared shows the more predictable consequence of ignoring trust, where automation and frictionless engagement do not clear the market, they amplify harm and economic instability. Trust, not throughput, is the mechanism of sustainable efficiency. Think about it this way. If you're trying to buy shoes on Amazon, where you know well and good because 1 in 3 shoe sellers admit that they're posting shoes that don't exist, you have to purchase a bunch of shoes in order to get one shoe. When tennis shoes are things that you can opt out of purchasing, ability to pay rent is not. That's what you're getting. In other words, efficiency without trust is self-reinforcing dysfunction. When you have employers openly admitting to posting evergreen roles as if that's not something they should be embarrassed about. Your market is a lemon. It's the extension of the thing that started when ATS was allowed in this industry. Recognizing this structural truth is the first step to designing markets that are not just faster, but functional and aligned with the real needs of the participants. Genuinely, it's like people don't realize that Vegas created slot machines instead of vending machines for a reason. Of course they did. I put a bunch of, check the research here, some stuff where you can look through some of the academic papers that talk about this sort of thing. Again, people are tangentially related talking about this, but for whatever reason, they don't apply. It's like a market is a market is a market is a market is a market, except for the hiring market. That's not a market. That's a little sacred shrine that we don't apply all of the logic that we currently have to. It's weird to me. But putting some together here. Alcott, B. Alcott, one on the Jevons Paradox and ecological economics. I'm sorry if I'm butchering names here. Pietro and Mayomi talked about unraveling the complexity of the Jevons Paradox, the link between innovation, efficiency, and sustainability. Jevons himself had one, obviously, because he wrote his own paradox. 1960s. Sorrell did one about the Jevons Paradox resisted, the evidence for backfire from improved energy efficiency. And so my own work, category in the talent acquisition industry, a job market for lemons, teach-out prototype, introduces 3 interlocking trust layers for online decentralized labor market governance. I have a fourth one, maybe in the works. We'll see. A way to see what we're building and how we plan to protect the market. In general, the job applicant perspective, returning to a market of trust. If the problem with current hiring systems is Micah's Paradox Squared, which also, by the way, is acre loves lemons, started via the ATS industry, Nash is not converging, and I've learned a new term, a red queen race. But I think we're talking about principal Asian issues, as well. Again, I'm learning these terms as I go. This is a living example of economics education. But for sure, it's Micah Paradox Squared, 2 stakeholder Jevons Paradox Squared. Efficiency gains applied to both sides without restoring trust. Then the solution isn't more automation or faster throughput. The solution is trust implemented at scale. TJAB does something deceptively simple. It gives job seekers access to opportunities they can trust and employers visibility into candidates who engage meaningfully with the system. The mechanism is user reviews. It's just that simple. User reviews on the job ad itself, not the employer, not the role, but the posting and the process it initiates. Job seekers review what actually happened. Did the role exist? Did anyone respond? Did the process match what the ad implied? This is closer to reviewing a movie screening than reviewing a studio. Frequent, low-stakes, high-volume signal that accumulates fast. A job seeker checking a posting can see that 12 previous applicants reported ghosting after 2 weeks, or that the role was filled internally before the ad went live. That information, visible before engagement, changes the calculus. Spray and pray stops being the dominant strategy when you can actually distinguish signal from noise. In other words, filters engagement by trustworthiness, not by frictionless speed. Reduces meaningless volume because candidates no longer feel compelled to chase every ad blindly. Restores signal because employers see who is genuinely interested and qualified. Think of it like the difference between a candy aisle and a carefully curated grocery store. A flashy, sugar-coated market encourages endless consumption that doesn't nourish its bling and noise. Thousands of job ads posted here. It's the language of casinos. That's not the language of the newspaper. That's not what they said. TJAP is the healthy food aisle. It makes choices obvious, valuable, and aligned with real need. In systems terms, trust is the efficiency mechanism. Trust is the efficiency mechanism. By restoring two-sided trust, the TJAP allows the market to clear properly rather than just process endless noise. Efficiency without trust creates the cascade. Trust without unnecessary friction clears it. Just saying, we actually do know what we're like. The economic principles are all there. We just have to stop being so abusive to them. Put another way, TJAP doesn't just improve the experience of engagement, it aligns instinct and action with meaningful opportunity. It's the antidote to the Jevons Paradox Squared in hiring markets. Conclusion, clearing the market, restoring trust. What this analysis reveals is simple in structure but profound in consequence. Efficiency alone cannot clear a two-sided market. Cannot. That's not how life works. I don't make the rules, reality does. I just read them from The Economist and put them into formalization. When speed, optimization, and frictionless engagement dominate, noise compounds, trust erodes, and the system feels louder, crueler, and harder to navigate. That is the Micah Paradox Squared in action. The rejected vulnerabilities of job seekers and the unbalanced incentives of employers cascading into structural dysfunction. But there is an alternative. Economics reminds us that relationships and markets should operate on two-sided trust. I need that one after my Aurora principle, but another day. Should operate on two-sided trust. For job seekers and employers alike, meaningful engagement requires both sides to trust the signals they see and act upon. That is precisely what TJAP restores. By making the mechanism of efficiency, TJAP flips trust. The mechanism of efficiency, TJAP flips the logic of modern hiring markets. Job seekers engage with opportunities they can evaluate and trust rather than every ad they encounter. If you make job seekers people who can evaluate their experience, not just people who need to endure it, they can actually, they're an unpaid audit machine for the market. It's ridiculous to not use it. There's a reason that all other markets use users' reviews, because obviously the fear that vendors have about using user reviews is more an indictment of the reality of the products that they know that they're putting out there. Because chefs that are proud of their products aren't afraid of diners describing them. Employers seek candidates to engage with intention, not just raw volume. The system clears not because engagement is maximized, but because trust directs attention towards value. TJAP doesn't sugarcoat the market, and it doesn't promise frictionless engagement. It promises clarity, certainty, and alignment. In a world where efficiency without trust created the cascade, trust itself becomes the true efficiency. In the end, the lesson is universal. Whether in labor markets, technology, or life, scale without trust amplifies harm. Trust without scale amplifies clarity. By centering trust as the guiding principle, we can finally design systems that are louder only in meaningful signal, not in noise, and clear paths emerge where chaos once reigned. Yeah, that's it. That's the sell. Yeah, especially for those geeks of labor market economics, I hope you enjoyed. I thought it was fascinating to think about, and I'm continuing to work with a mathematician from Johns Hopkins to engage on the exact dynamics of, because we have here in the labor markets, I'm fairly certain I can identify it, Jevons Paradox, at least squared on either end of the market, because you have AI and ATS on one side, and you have one click apply on the other. But then you're also engaging with ATS itself, which created Akerlof's lemons back in the beginning with information asymmetry, the way that they process applications. And then they also, from the beginning, have created Nash's non-converging equilibrium. So you have that. But then on top of that, you have ghost jobs being openly reported because vendors obviously profit from having job seekers unnecessarily for extended periods on platforms, you know? And then you have employers admitting to posting evergreen roles, which is an amplification of Akerlof's lemons. It's a predictable outcome of it. So you have all of these features come together, and I've learned a couple more terms now: a red queen race, and yeah, principal agent issues. But regardless, I'm just kind of intrigued to think about where those aspects of Jevons and Nash overlap and where they're actually functionally different, because it's Nash in the perception of what it does, but it's Jevons in the functionality of what it does to some. Anyways, stuff that percolates in my brain. And I wouldn't be surprised if I'm slightly off on about 10% of it at least. I don't know. Making good guesses and being perfectly right about things that people haven't perfectly studied yet and your mathematician friends haven't totally helped you with is an error to assume. But pretty sure I got the handle on it nonetheless. Anyway, please like, follow, share, and repost, and like, follow, share, and engage and ask questions. I love to think and talk and engage on this topic, and I'd be fascinated to hear from others. So, yeah, have a good one.